Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I'm Alondra Nelson, President of the Social Science Research Council and Professor of Sociology at Columbia University. We're pleased that you've joined us for what promises to be an enlightening and engaging evening. I would first like to thank the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute here at Hunter for hosting this program. As always, our deep history of collaboration on this and countless other events is so valuable to the Council, and we're deeply grateful. Thank you especially to Howard Holzer, the Jonathan Fanton Director of Roosevelt House, who has once again welcomed the SSRC into FDR's home. Howard could not be with us tonight, regrettably, as he has found something even better to do. He's delivering the Dedication Day keynote address in Soldiers National Cemetery at the Gettysburg National Military Park on the 154th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. A deeply, richly deserved honor for Howard that speaks to the esteem with which his scholarship on Lincoln and the Civil War is held. The Social Science Research Council is an international, interdisciplinary organization dedicated to galvanizing knowledge and mobilizing it for the public good. The Council's work is rooted in the belief that robust social knowledge is essential to achieving justice, prosperity, and equality. One of our primary roles is to support the next generation of scholars, and to date, in the SSRC's history, we've awarded more than 15,000 fellowships. So we have a robust network and community of affiliates and past and present fellows. And we currently fund about 350 fellows per year. On any given day, the SSRC is working in diverse locations around the world, and we have affiliates and networks of doing both national and international research on a range of topics, including health and the environment, the economy and religion, and on tonight's topics, democracy and governance, and inequality in all its forms. The Council does this by generating new research and supporting innovation in social science scholarship, by enhancing the capacity of institutions around the world to support their own scholars, to engage effectively with local issues, and through building networks and communicating knowledge to a range of audiences and sectors, including policymakers, practitioners, and citizens. The SSRC's Anxieties of Democracy program is pleased to sponsor tonight's program, as well as the series of seminars for graduate students and faculty that Professor Allen has led in her role as the SSRC's 2017 Democracy Fellow. I want to introduce and acknowledge Christella Trump, who is Program Director for the Anxieties of Democracy program. Christella, she's there. Thank you. Christella and her team have done a remarkable job, and they've done so much to make this residency with Professor Allen, of which this lecture is a part, both a possibility and a success. The Anxieties of Democracy program is motivated by a concern about whether the core institutions of established democracies can capably address large problems in the public interest. The programs are, the ambitions of the programs are diagnostic to identify causes of perceived anxieties about representative democracies, and prescriptive to explore possible solutions. I would invite you to read more about the Anxieties of Democracy initiative in the insert in your program. Tonight, we will have the pleasure to hear first from Professor Danielle Allen on political equality, a lecture representing her current research focused on difference, connected societies, and empowering economies. Her talk will be followed by a response by Professor Jeremy Waldron of New York University, as well as a conversation and question and answer session with the audience, and then we will have the honor of having our speakers signing a selection of their books concurrent with a reception upstairs in the Four Freedoms room. So please do join us for that. And now I am pleased and privileged to introduce Danielle Allen. Indeed. Danielle Allen is director of the Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics and the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard, the university's highest honor. Prior to joining the faculty at Harvard in 2015, Allen was UPS Foundation Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. A classicist and a political scientist holding a PhD in each of these fields, she is considered, and rightly so, one of the most brilliant and profound political theorists today, focusing much of her work on issues of political equality, justice, and challenges to democracy, from ancient Athens to the founding of this country to the present day. In 2002, Allen was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship for her, quote, ability to combine the classicist's careful attention to text and language with the political theorist's sophisticated and informed engagement. Allen is a former trustee of Amherst College and Princeton University and is a past chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board. She is chair of the Mellon Foundation Board and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as the American Philosophical Society. She is a frequent public lecturer and regular guest in the media, as well as a contributor to the Washington Post, Boston Review, and The Nation, among other publications. Professor Allen's recent published works make rigorous scholarship accessible, influential, compelling, and moving. She is the author of several books, as you know, including this year's Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A. Cuz has been described as ambitious, breathtaking, and a literary miracle in form and content. The Washington Post said that the work pleads with us to find a moral imagination to break the American pattern of racial abuse. This kind of critical acclaim has been a constant in Danielle Allen's career, and it's particularly pronounced in her writings on equality, democracy, and race. Her 2004 book, Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship Since Brown versus the Board of Education, was called Powerful and Eloquent. Her 2014 book, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence and Defense of Equality, is a work in the Allen canon particularly relevant to tonight's lecture. The New York Review of Books called this work remarkable and a tour de force. And the National Review said Our Declaration was an eloquent book, deeply moving, personal, and conversational in style, yet deeply and seriously philosophical. They also called this book an uncommon book for an uncommon document. The scholarship of Danielle Allen is certainly uncommon, the rare treasured kind that makes us both feel and think deeply. Please join me in welcoming Professor Danielle Allen.
That was extraordinary. Thank you. I'm so grateful, deeply. It's a rare privilege, I always say to people, to be a writer and to be read. And so to be read and have people understand what you're doing thank you, truly. And it's a pleasure to be here and to see friends in the audience as well and new faces. It's true that I have a book that came out this fall called Cuz, which is a personal narrative and a memoir. And so some of you might be expecting me to talk about that. But I did put the title Political Equality on the lecture, which I have to admit is a little bit like those colleagues of mine who always schedule their courses at 8 a.m. So in order to ensure that the folks who come to participate are ready for something serious. And I am going to invite you this evening to join me in my journey as a political philosopher, more specifically. And I'll ask you to join me in thinking about some of the abstract, basic concepts that define democracy and our democratic aspirations. I think this is important, actually, because I think a lot of our contemporary experiences in all domains, political, social, and economic, flow, in fact, from some intellectual mistakes that we've been making consistently over the last few decades, which I am seeking to try to correct. So I'm asking you to join me in a journey into political philosophy that I hope will also then bring us back into some concrete political realities at the end. When people invoke the concept of political equality, the first sets of issues that come to people's mind tend to be things like campaign finance reform, felon disfranchisement, voter ID laws, and so forth. And if you'd ask somebody what political equality consisted of, roughly 14 months ago, I think that's what would have come out first and foremost. But that was before we all have been so seriously surprised by events. The election of Trump, Brexit, for example. And so I think in order to address the topic of political equality, we actually have to begin by understanding why we were so surprised by those events. And I think that inquiry leads us to see how a set of policy paradigms that we've been using for the last few decades have blind spots in them. My belief is that a shift of our attention to political equality will help us correct those blind spots. But let me try to articulate that a little bit more fully. So what I'm going to do is try to explain what I think have been our blind spots, propose an alternative, and then bring us around at the end to a different issue that may perhaps be the most important issue from the perspective of thinking about political equality. But you'll have to judge that for yourselves and let me know what you think. So we were, of course, surprised not just by Brexit and Trump, but also by the recession of 2008. In that regard, we've been living in a state of intellectual surprise for almost a decade. And we really ought to make sense of that to ourselves. Why is it that we have been so taken by surprise? The dominant policy paradigm, I would say, coming out of places like Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and operating in think tanks in Washington and in policymaking spaces, is a fusion of two things. On the one hand, utilitarian economic welfarism, and on the other, sort of Rawlsian welfarism. And let me explain what I mean by both of those things. So on the utilitarian model, the goal is to maximize happiness, utility, as the economists describe it, for society. Cast in the effort to do that, sort of cast in language in its crudest form, sort of cost-benefit analysis, trying to sort of tally up different people's preferences where you are obscuring from their particularities. And the way in which we go about trying to achieve utilitarian welfare maximization is through forms of developmental policies that focus routinely on issues of income and wealth and their distribution and their redistribution, how we think about managing that set of interactions. John Rawls is a philosopher who in 1971 published an important book called Theory of Justice. And one of his main goals was actually to correct utilitarianism in key ways. And so I think it's a paradox of the last 25 years that although he sought to correct utilitarianism, there's ways in which I think he's actually accidentally reinforced it. But in the Rawlsian framework, the goal of a just society is to do two things. One, to protect a set of basic liberties. So for the first thing you have to do, and those basic liberties are things like right of association, right to free expression, and then the right to participate politically, sort of a spectrum of basic rights. And then the second thing that you need to do is, within the constraints of protecting those rights, pursue social and economic structures that are to the benefit of the least well-off in society and that secure equal opportunity, fair equal opportunity throughout the society. But there's an interesting, so the sense in which the Rawlsian paradigm connects to the utilitarian paradigm is that as people have tried to think about justice, in a funny way, precisely because the rights part was hived off from the economic part, the focus has been on the distributive questions. And so Rawlsianism in the policy world has turned into a basic focus on redistributive taxation. That's the policy that comes out of conversations about Rawls over and over again. And that actually, in a funny way, connects to the utilitarian effort to think about maximizing distribution of economic benefits. Now, the fact of this policy paradigm, though, too, is, as I've described it, you can hear that the core question for justice is one of material distribution, economic distribution and well-being. This is familiar to us. When we invoke the concept of social justice, the first thing that we have in mind is a question of economic distribution. And as I have worked in the academy for the last couple of decades, it's very clear to me that when people want to begin a conversation about policy or politics by invoking the issue of inequality, the relevant kind of inequality is almost invariably economic inequality. Okay, so that's what we know how to talk about, and we've had this policy paradigm coming out of economics and utilitarianism on the one hand, and Rawlsianism on the other that has supported and structured that. Now, there are two features of this policy paradigm that I want to call your attention to. The first is that on both sides, the utilitarian side and the Rawlsian side, start from disappearing contextual specifics, okay? In the Rawlsian case, this comes in the theory of justice in that we are asked to imagine a veil of ignorance where we don't know what our social situations are, and we're to project what would be principles of justice for a society where we don't know where we would land. Would it be at the top, at the bottom? What would be our role? And that's how we generate the principles of justice. And those principles of justice are supposed to apply universally in any social situation. And similarly, in the economic context, precisely because utility is an extremely hard concept to turn into something practical, we turn it into financial. We use money as a proxy for utility, and money is something that is translated into a currency and can be compared across contexts and countries and so forth without reference to the underlying demographic facts on the ground of a particular country or situation. So in other words, one of the things that these policy paradigms do is turn our attention away from the underlying demographic arrangements of a society. Who has power according to what sorts of institutional structures, according to what kinds of allocations of resources and opportunities. We lose the specificity of the analysis of any given situation in a country by virtue of deploying this policy paradigm over and over again. Now, in my view, the fact that this policy paradigm has become so stable and has had the consequence of obscuring for us underlying social phenomena and patterns relates actually to a small philosophical mistake that I see coming into the philosophical tradition in the early 19th century. And what this philosophical mistake is a conceptual distinction between two halves of that set of basic rights. All right, so when I gave you that list of basic rights, I first invoked right of association, freedom of expression, and then I moved on to a right to participate. And there was an early 19th century French thinker named Benjamin Constant who considered basic rights, human rights of this kind, and divided them into two categories. He called them the rights of the ancients, which were rights to participate in politics, in shaping our collective lives. That was the first set. And then the second set was what he called the rights of the moderns. From his point of view, these are what we would now call negative rights. The right to be left alone, to take your property, which you have a right to, so a right to property in the first instance, and to engage in commercial transactions in pursuit of your own well-being. All right, so the rights of the ancients were political rights, to be a part of a society working together to steer itself, collective decision-making. And the rights of the moderns were about private autonomy, having the rights to steer your own life and being more or less left alone by any collective decision-making to the maximum degree possible. That distinction has worked its way into the philosophical tradition. It was extended by Isaiah Berlin in the early 20th century. And Rawls, in his arguments, argues that he's putting them back together again, that we need to protect the whole set of basic rights. But in fact, in various technical ways I won't go into, the political rights become sacrificable for him in his argument. And we end up focusing then in our thinking about politics on the combination of private rights, right to autonomy, property, association, expression, and so forth, and the economic questions that are connected to that. So both the wealth that can be generated from property and the need for redistribution that comes from the unequal flow of the gains of productivity across a population, all right? So in other words, when you lose sight of the political rights and focus primarily on the private rights, you can focus exclusively on economic questions and lose sight of political questions, all right? And that's what I see as having happened in the policy paradigm that developed in the second half of the 20th century. There's a part of the story, too, which is about the transition over the 20th century from the influence of law on public policy to the influence of economics. And there's a sociologist named Elizabeth Popp Berman who's written very effectively about this. And there's a lot more to be said about how it is that economics has come to have that dominance. But that transition from law to economics underscores the point I'm making, because legal thinking, again, is about institutions in specific societies and their consequences for specific societies. And yes, we have disciplines called comparative law and so forth, where you compare legal systems in different places. But to do that work requires, in the first instance, seeing the specificity of a specific set of legal institutions, not erasing specificity in the hopes of achieving a kind of universal policy paradigm. To give you a concrete example of how this policy paradigm works, think about the way in which the World Bank approaches development, right, where there's sort of a set of kind of boilerplate requirements that are put on developing societies that are sort of rolled out across the board, a sort of cookie cutter approach. And this is the kind of policy paradigm that I'm trying to suggest gave us the blind spots that left us surprised by not only 2008, but also Brexit and Trump. So what might be an alternative, and how might that alternative better have helped us see those kinds of phenomena coming? So the alternative I'm arguing for is one in which we do actually start our thinking about justice by thinking about political equality. Now let me explain the connection between those two concepts. What I'm doing here is inviting you to join me in rethinking the concept of equality and its different types. So my experience is that very few of us take the time to actually work out how different kinds of equality relate to each other. So there's moral human equality, there's political equality, there's social equality, there's economic equality or economic egalitarianism, and the list goes on. Racial equality, gender equality, and so forth. We don't typically stop actually to think about the relations among these. And the relationship I'd like to propose among them is that human moral equality is fundamental. Professor Waldron has written about that in his new book, and he'll talk about that in a minute. But understanding human moral equality is fundamentally about understanding the human need to be an author of, each person be an author of his or her own life. Okay, so that's an autonomy concept, that we need to be an author of our own life that is a part of human flourishing. But the complication is, it's not enough to be an author of your own life as an individual in an autonomous space, because all of us live inside of a set of societal constraints. There is no way we can proceed through the world without recognizing constraints that come from laws, that come from shared cultural practices, and so forth. And so then the only way to be fully autonomous is actually to be a co-creator of those social constraints. And so the argument then is that the need for human flourishing is a matter of both private autonomy and public autonomy, participation in collective decision-making. And the achievement of public autonomy depends on political equality, all right? So that's the line from basic human flourishing to political equality as intrinsically valuable to humans, as a basic part of human flourishing. All right, so if you start thinking about justice there and just hold economic questions off to the side for a second, what happens? That's the question. Well, first you've got to define political equality a little bit more completely to see what I'm getting at here. Because by now, if I'm making it this fundamental, you can probably tell I don't just mean campaign finance, the right to vote, and so forth. Those are the formal, a small number of formal institutional mechanisms that we use to try to achieve political equality. But what is the concept in a bigger, fuller way? So my argument is that I can identify 5 facets of it. I think that this is not meant to be a comprehensive list. This is meant to be a sort of starter set for thinking about the concept of political equality. And I'm going to just tell you what they are and not flesh them out too much right now, but you feel free to ask more about them. So one is the notion that political equality requires an experience of non-domination in both social contexts and in contexts of operating within political institutions. A second is equal access to the institutions of government, sort of being able to pull and participate in pulling sort of levers of political institutions equally. The third is something that I call epistemic egalitarianism. Now, what does this mean exactly? This one's a little harder to think about. So this is the notion that in any functioning democracy, part of what the democracy needs to do is make good decisions based on good knowledge gathering processes for gathering knowledge and sorting it and making judgments on the basis of it. And any good process on this argument includes both a reliance on expertise, but also a reliance on the kind of social knowledge that ordinary people have, and processes that put those in a strong relationship to each other, so that decisions are being made based on the knowledge base of the citizenry as a whole in some metaphorical sense, okay? Again, happy to talk more about that one if you'd like. I'm just going to throw it out there for the moment. And the fourth facet is reciprocity, which is about a relational ethic that citizens have with one another. The ability to look each other in the eye, the ability to propose the need for redress, and to be secure in the expectation that redress will be possible within constraints of reasonableness and so forth. And so you might think, for example, of some of the controversy around the issue of police violence as tapping into that need of citizens for redress, and reciprocity expressed through practices of redress of grievances. And then the fifth facet is something that I call co-ownership of political institutions. It's a matter of recognizing all the machinery of a democracy, all of the assemblies and congresses and state assemblies and judicial offices and all of that as an asset, as a form of property that we own together. And then to follow through on the question, what does it mean for us to own all of that property together, to have co-ownership in relationship to it? Okay, so that's the sort of big picture concept of what I mean by political equality. And so now, having laid that out for you and asked you to think about equality without invoking economic questions, having asked you to sort of go through the discipline of that exercise, I then think it's reasonable and necessary to ask the question of how to think about the relationship between social and economic realms and political institutions. Okay, so let me try to explain what I mean and where I'm going here. So if you just think about political equality, then your first instinct might be asked the question, well, how do we reform our political institutions to achieve some of those facets that you just talked about, right? And then we can come back to some of the issues of campaign finance and voter ID and things like that. And I might throw in, I'm very interested in something called the Fair Representation Act, which is like a dead on arrival idea in Congress, bill in Congress at the moment, which would convert congressional election systems to being multi-member districts and rank order voting, which would have the effect in the sense of, roughly speaking, kind of proportional representation effect on our structure. It would mean more voices in particular districts were contributing to the conversation. Representatives in Congress they would be self-consciously serving, or you'd have a Democratic and a Republican in the same district serving the same constituency, and therefore they'd have to figure out some way that they could both serve their constituency together. It would change the dynamics of compromise and so forth, and the voices that are pulled in. So when I lay out my facets of political equality, I can then take you right back to thinking about political institutions and how we might reform them. But I'd rather take you to a different kind of problem, all right? And that is the problem of how it is to think about the social realm and the economic realm and the ways in which they can or perhaps don't themselves support political equality, okay? So in other words, I'm going to ask you to revisit questions of, say, economic justice from the point of view of how do we develop economic policy that supports political equality? If we make economic policy and social policy, in some sense, secondary to, instrumental to the goal of generating egalitarian empowerment, political equality, what's the result? Okay, so here at this point, I arrive at something of a sort of paradox in how we think about basic rights. I think it's a resolvable paradox, but it starts off feeling like a paradox. And it goes like this, that if you protect, for example, the right to association, you end up with social difference. And that's a great and beautiful thing, right? But social difference also easily articulates with domination or caste society structures and so forth. So there's no way you can have your basic rights without getting social difference. And similarly, if you protect the right to contract, for example, the right to property, you will get economic structures that can articulate with domination. Again, same thing, that can articulate with the kinds of inequalities that are disempowering of citizens, all right? So it looks as if just plain protecting our basic rights is already going to undermine our pursuit of political equality. So what do we do about that? So the argument that I'm making is that it means we have to then think about the social realm and establish a principle for ourselves that we're pursuing, so that in the social realm, for example, yes, difference will emerge, and that's a wonderful thing, a good thing, and it needs to be difference without domination. Because we have to scrutinize our institutions to think about how do you separate domination from social difference. I'll give you an example in a minute of a place where that happens. And on the other hand, similarly with the economic realm, how do we have economies that empower people? What are the sets of economic policies that produce empowerment? Right? Sort of a different question than the one you ask when you start with a question about distribution. All right, so now where does that take us in the social realm? I'll spend a minute there, and then I'm going to spend the most of my time for the end of this on the economic question. So here is one interesting example that has emerged from the law that I think counts as an example of difference without domination. And that shows the way in which you get a sort of compromise in some sense between different parts of the basic rights set, okay? So, and this is an example of the law thinking as a kind of collective social practice. Now, there's something in the Fair Housing Act called Mrs. Murphy's Exception that some of you may have heard of. Now, the Fair Housing Act is a law that prohibits landlords from discriminating when they rent to tenants. Now, what's Mrs. Murphy's Exception? It's the exception that if you're Mrs. Murphy and you have a building with 4 or fewer units and you want to rent only to other Irish Americans, that's okay. You're permitted to do that, to discriminate. All right? And the reason is because the notion is the scale is small enough that that kind of discrimination won't end up to systemic domination, won't amount to, won't aggregate to systemic domination. And interestingly, that compromise has been arrived at other points in the law too. Again, like not by design, not because anybody set about to do this, but it's emerged as the compromise point. So for example, in small business law, if I understand it correctly, and lawyers here will correct me if I've not got it right, businesses below a certain size, and the number varies from state to state, but it tends to be in this sort of 16 to 18 person zone, are exempt from non-discrimination employment law if they're below that size. Same principle, difference without domination, because we think that's the threshold below which we don't get dominating effects. All right? So there you go. So that's one example of how this principle might work. I make a more elaborate argument in what I'm working on now about the need to think about a connected society and the way in which we build bridging ties that link bonding communities and communities of difference to each other to generate the egalitarian social dynamics that work against domination in the social sphere. I'm going to spare you all of that right now. I'm just like, that was a road sign in case anybody wants to ask about it. So let me come around to the economic questions and the issue of how to build empowering economies. So there are 2 things that I want to say here. The first is to show you the kind of shift of focus that my line of analysis generates. So as I said, under the paradigm that we've been used to working in, the first thing we think about is redistribution, taxation and redistribution, and sort of welfarist model. But what I'm suggesting is that we might actually instead think about production, all right? And that actually there's even a tradition in this country of thinking about how to organize production with egalitarian effects. What does this mean exactly? It's to recognize that land, labor, and capital, and how we organize those things all have a powerful effect on the kinds of economic results that emerge in a society in the first place. And again, it's the law that structures how we organize land, labor, and capital. And just to give you a couple of concrete small examples, some of you heard these earlier today. Let's take you back to the founding of the American Republic and give you a little story about how people like Thomas Jefferson and others thought about the relationship between political equality and economic egalitarianism. So at the time of the American Revolution, this country was more economically egalitarian than anything Europe had seen. Something like 65% of white men were property owners at the time of the Revolution. Nothing like that existed in Europe with its still lingering kind of feudal effects and aristocratic landed estates and so forth. And the founders understood that this middle-class economy was part of what was making their bid for political equality and a democratic system of government possible. Jefferson, for example, argued against laws of primogeniture, that sort of inheritance to the firstborn. And the reason he argued against this was precisely in order to set up an economy that would be breaking up big estates over time and keeping things in a more middling zone, economically speaking. Another example of this kind of egalitarian way of thinking about the economy comes from Georgia. And this is an example that helps show the downside as well as the upside of this economic egalitarianism. So in the 1830s, Georgia had what's called the Georgia Land Lottery. Has anybody heard of the Georgia Land Lottery? I'm just curious. Oh, good. Excellent. So in the Georgia Land Lottery, land was given out to white men, white widows, white orphans, by lottery in equal parcels. Okay, that's how egalitarian they were. But where did they get the land, right? They got the land from Native Americans whom they'd just driven out on the Cherokee Trail of Tears. So the egalitarianism was linked to an extractive, exploitative economic measure. So the history, in other words, teaches us two things. The first, that the aspiration to political equality was coupled at the founding, and I could give you lots of other examples too, with the recognition that economic egalitarianism is necessary to support political equality. But the political economy that they developed to secure that was flawed is not a sufficient word, right? It was grounded on extreme injustice that by, in fact, not including Native Americans in the circle of people to whom political equality applied, undid the validity and value of the entire enterprise in moral terms, okay? So that then brings us back to the present with a couple of things to think about. The first that I've pointed to, the ways in which political equality does need economic egalitarianism, that thinking about that is partly about thinking about things like land, labor, and capital. In our modern context, I would say that means thinking about housing, transportation, as well as issues of labor rights in work environments and the quality of work experience inside firms. You know, the issue of venture capital being the owners of the companies that hold American workers in such a way that no longer do people work for General Motors, they work for General Atlantic. Instead, there's no direct connection between the managers and the workers and the owners, et cetera. So there are ways in which that dynamic leaves workers exposed. Or take universities where they outsource dining services and so forth, and consequently there's actually no path of advancement for workers inside the organization, which is different from the situation 20 or 30 years ago. So there's a lot of ways in which, in lots of policy domains, again, sort of housing, transportation, labor rights, that are relevant. But I want to bring us to the sort of bigger issue of political economy that I think is the challenge in front of us. And that is this one, which is if you take political equality as your starting point and take it seriously and think that political equality is intrinsically valuable to human flourishing, then how do you build a political economy on top of that idea that doesn't subject some people to exploitation? Okay, that's the kind of political economy question. And now let me give you a concrete example of a policy question we're currently thinking about where that is the key issue. So in 2014, an economist and law professor at the University of Chicago published an article in the New Republic. Their names are Glenn Weil, he's at the University of Chicago at the time, now at one of the tech firms, and Eric Posner, been at Chicago, now at Harvard. And the title of the article was something along the lines of, to fix inequality, or something like that, make America more like Qatar. I can't remember the exact title of it. And so what's the argument of this? The argument is that the biggest, inequality, which in their article implicitly means economic inequality, they don't take the time to spell out which concept they're using, but it is economic. Global inequality would be best addressed if developed countries could maximize their intake of immigrants, okay, and thereby through remittances, but also the increased earnings of immigrants in the developed countries, there would be a global shift in the distribution of income and wealth, all right? Now, but then the second, then the shoe drops in their argument, what would it take for developed countries to maximize their intake of immigrants? It would take accepting having a permanent labor structure such as Qatar's, with a permanent structure of laborers who are both not enfranchised and never have any pathway to enfranchisement, all right? So in other words, is to in pursuit of maximum economic egalitarianism from a distributive point of view, to forego political equality altogether as a basic human expectation and human aspiration. All right, now this policy question is on our map, right? Because we are a country with 11 million undocumented workers stuck in limbo. And we're trying to figure out how we think about this. So it strikes me that on the argument that I've been making, the kind of direction one would have to go is to say that a democracy that is committed to political equality as its grounding ideal can't accept a permanent laboring class with no pathway to citizenship. That in fact, we do need to establish political equality as a basic expectation for members of our polity, and that we ought in some sense to think that the human good is connected to that more generally, but that then we have the hard problem of figuring out how to build a political economy where we've accepted that. Now, I think a part of accepting that we want political equality as a basic ideal is actually to accept limitations on immigration, okay? So this is one of the, conclusions I come to through this. That is perhaps not where many of us would initially have started, okay? But limitations connected to pathway to citizenship, and then also a request to economists to help us see how to achieve growth, how to achieve egalitarian, empowering economies in contexts where there is no caste system. Does that make sense as a question? I'm not sure I articulated it terribly well. What I'm trying to say is so Glenn, who's a friend, and Eric have answered the question that our reigning policy paradigm put on the table for them. The reigning policy paradigm on the table asks the question, how can we make maximally equal the distribution of wealth in a sort of context non-specific way around the world, okay? And they've answered that question. You can do that by giving up political equality. That's their answer. And so what I'm saying is, well, okay, good. They actually answered the question that we put to them because we'd taken political equality out of the equation. We'd stopped actually conveying its centrality and its importance. So can we develop a different answer, a different political economy, if we put a different question on the table? In other words, if the question on the table is that, the starting point is that in order to secure human flourishing, any given society should properly, not that they all will, be pursuing political equality, then given that constraint, how do we build the most empowering economies possible? And there's two parts to that question. How do we do that for ourselves, which is a doable thing in relationship to the policy domains I just mentioned, again, focusing on housing, transportation, labor, and so forth. There's a lot that we could do to build a more empowering economy. But then there's a second question which flows from it, which is how do we think about economic well-being and supporting it in other parts of the world? Okay, in other words, if our commitment to political equality means that we're not going to approach economic well-being through accepting a caste system, then what kind of responsibility do we have to develop a political economy that won't be extractive or exploitative of other parts of the globe? Okay? And so there, the thought is, in the first instance, that the answer should be something like the one that Marshall provided at the end of World War II in thinking about Europe. Okay? And Marshall, there, just to paraphrase of the idea, his argument was that the job that they needed to do after World War II was to help build economies that worked, quote, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. Let me just read that again. You need to structure the economy, work on structuring it, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. Now, this is importantly different from the kind of idea that took us into Iraq, all right? The kind of idea that took us into Iraq was an idea about building certain kind of political institutions, not about fostering the conditions in which those institutions could exist. Okay, so that's a question for all of you. Is that a difference that matters? Okay, something to think about. But let's, for a moment, take it that it does matter. I think what that would mean might be that our most important foreign policy question would be how to help stabilize legal regimes and functioning politics in Central America and South America. A question which is off our radar screen almost completely at the moment when we think about foreign policy, all right? But deeply entangled with our economy because of the drug war. I won't go there for the moment. All right, so let me try to summarize what I've just said about the political economy. Okay, what I've just said is that if one reorients our basic thinking about theory of justice and social theory by starting from the intrinsic value to human beings of political equality, you end up with a different focus in social policy, and I gave you the example out of the sort of housing space, difference without domination, but also a different focus with regard to economics that's about focusing on how to build empowering economies, both domestically and then also how to support empowering economies outside of our own borders. And I believe that that is a set of questions that we should be putting to economists, asking them to take responsibility for. I'm not myself equipped to deliver answers about what that political economy looks like, but the question I'm putting to you is that a reasonable set of questions for us to be asking our economists to answer? Because if they were answering those, they would be driving our policy landscape in very different directions than they have been driving it because of the questions we've been asking them for the last 30 years. Okay? So finally, let me just close by saying, so how would this political equality idea help us avoid the surprises of Brexit, an election of Trump, and so forth? In the first place, the idea requires deeper contextual knowledge of the political situation of any given place. You can't actually think about policy without thinking about the distribution of power. The approach also takes us to the heart of thinking about human dignity and the desire that people have to be co-creators of a collective body. And I think both of those issues lie behind the failure that we all experience to see the dynamics of our political circumstances. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Danielle. I mean, as a citizen, I also say thank you for this, a lesson in how deep examination can help us sort of push through, I think, what feels like the paralysis of this moment. And I think it was really good to be able to think with you about where we are and what kind of concepts can get us somewhere else. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Professor Jeremy Waldron. Waldron is a university professor of law at New York University, his institution's highest faculty honor, where he teaches legal and political philosophy. Prior to NYU, he taught at Columbia University, Princeton University, and the University of Oxford. He is a native of New Zealand, where he served as the solicitor to the New Zealand Supreme Court. Much of Professor Waldron's deep and profound scholarship is rooted in the exploration of the nature of human equality. He has written and published extensively in jurisprudence and political theory. His books and articles on theories of rights, constitutionalism, the rule of law, democracy, and other themes are well known, as is his work in historical political theory, including Aristotle, Hobbes, Locke, and Arendt. Professor Waldron's latest book, which he will be signing following the program, is One Another's Equals, The Basis of Human Equality. The book examines one of the earliest principles of Western philosophy, its origins, its challenges, and what the phrase one another's equals even means in the past and for today. Professor Waldron is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and also the American Philosophical Society, from which he received the Distinguished Phillips Prize for Lifetime Achievement in Jurisprudence. Join me in welcoming Professor Jeremy Waldron.
Thank you very much. I need to correct one impression given by that lovely, generous introduction. I'm a barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of New Zealand, which is a routine, having been admitted to the bar, but it doesn't mean that I served in any ministerial function, and that was many years ago. Now, we've been treated to a wonderful lecture this evening in this discussion of political equality, and I share and applaud so many of the sentiments that Professor Allen set out, that it's going to be hard for me to pick any fights. And anyway, it's not the function of a commentator to pick fights, but to indicate areas of common interest and areas where we can work together. I agreed with a lot of what was said in the second part of the lecture particularly, although on the Glenn and Eric proposal with regard to increasing the amount of equality in the world by bringing more immigrants to the United States, but having them established as a caste. Before I wanted to agree with Professor Allen that we may need to restrict immigration in order to secure political equality here, which is a very important aim, I would want to think a little bit about alternative models to the one that Glenn and Eric Posner had pursued. One obvious model, controversial in the light of Brexit, is the EU model, where people from relatively poor countries in Europe can move freely to relatively prosperous countries and vice versa, and secure at least a modicum of political equality in relation to European institutions and increasingly in relation to national institutions as well. And I don't see why we have to move to a Qatar-style guest worker system. I also worry a little bit about the idea of establishing equality one society at a time. So we have an island of equality here and an island of equality there in a sea of inequality. It does seem to me that there is a worry, particularly if the equality is established at a very high level relative to the background level of subsistence in the world. So I would just urge that we can take some of these matters into consideration. But mostly, as I said, I wanted to share and applaud what was said about the importance of political equality, its priority in a theory of justice, its priority in a theory of liberty, its priority in a theory of democracy. It's extremely important idea, and it needs much deeper exploration than it has in political philosophy so far. I share the suggestion that Professor Allen made, that there have been a number of bad turnings in our theory of politics where we have turned our back a little bit on the importance of political equality in comparison with the other basic liberties. I share some of her reservations about John Rawls's theory in that regard. But I wanted to develop, in the brief time that I will inflict on you, I want to develop just 2 points about political equality. The first is to insist that we make sure we keep the political in political equality. I have a new book called Political Theory, and it's trying to insist that we keep an emphasis on political institutions in our theory of politics. So there the important thing is that political equality is about politics. And politics looks to deadly serious matters. It looks beyond itself. Political equality is not just a game played for its own sake, although it is a game that's partly played for its own sake. That is, we insist that we be treated as equals in our democracy, partly for the reason so we can continue to establish, maintain, and advance the state and the condition of our democracy. But there are other things that need to be established, maintained, and advanced as well. Economic equality, to the extent that that's distinct from political equality, social justice generally, the conditions of the general good, the basis of the security of the nation. These are all ways in which political equality looks beyond itself, not in a self-denying way. It is rather that as political equals, we demand access to what Professor Allen called the levers of power, so that we can equally exercise these powers on matters that really are important to all of us. It's not a game. Politics is not a game. The stakes are very, very high as the general idea of the common good, as high as the idea of providing a bearable environment for people to live and have their families and raise their children, as high as securing some degree of dignity and prosperity throughout the community. So political equality looks beyond itself, just as politics looks beyond itself. When we vote, we're not just making a move in a game, we're trying to bring about a result. When we work in politics, we're trying to insist that somehow it will be up to us what happens in this incomparably important area. So that if we take political equality, we have to take other things. If we take political equality seriously, we have to take other things seriously, because that's what political equality is about. And In addition, if we take political equality, we have to take political participation seriously. And we have to take the idea of equal political participation seriously. And my second point is to try to put the equal back into political equality. I'm a little bit more preoccupied than Professor Allen is, I think, with voting systems, with representation, with majority decision. These are all important in a community whose members, whose politically equal members, disagree with one another. I mean, think of the United States as more than 250 million of us, all highly opinionated, and snarling and muttering at each other because we have rival conceptions of political life. And so in a context of disagreement about what matters, which means that when I confront your views on some political issue and you confront mine, we are, in a sense, recoiling with dismay. You really believe that? You really want to move our society in that direction? Do you have any idea what that will do to my health care? And you say, you really believe that? You really want to stick with these old customs? You have any idea what that will do with our corporate competitiveness and so on? People recoil from one another's political positions. They disagree with them, and the disagreement matters. It's not just a game. And disagreement, I believe, is the fundamental condition of politics. So political equality is the determination that we have that we will treat one another as equals, and we will treat one another with equal respect, despite our disagreements. In spite of the fact that your views offend me and my views offend you, we will nevertheless accredit each other as equal citizens and grant and tolerate each other having equal access to the levers of power. And none of this is inconsistent with what Professor Allen, it's all advanced as a way of just elaborating, I think, the idea she set out. Take it a step further. I believe political equality is, to a great degree, a matter of equal respect. I've written this book about one another's equals, and starting from the very elementary assumption that all humans are entitled to equal concern and respect. And I agree with Professor Allen that political equality flows, in some sense, naturally and immediately from that. Respect is not just etiquette. Respect is not even just political correctness, though it may be capture whatever is valuable about political correctness. Respect it's about toleration of rival views. It's about a determination not to regard views that you strongly disagree with as therefore for that reason disloyal or un-American. It's a determination to accommodate rival views within a single political system. Respect is about saying of somebody else's views, you've reached those in a way that I can't understand, and you hold these views that I don't agree with, but I'm going to respect. Those are opinions held by a human being, and they command respect as such. And not just respect, again, in the sense of a nod and a smile, but respect in the sense of saying, now it's your turn at the voting machine. Now it's your turn to pass the levers of power. We believe very strongly that we have an obligation of respect to be patient with each other's views, which partly means listening. And listening, as Stephen Carter once said, not with your mouth, but with your ears. Listening with your mouth is just waiting for the other person to draw a breath. So you can say, never mind that, here's what I think. And so that we have to be patient with opposing views. And I mean really patient, and really patient with opposing views. I mean listening to the people who support President Trump. Not dismissing that, not saying I've never been so offended in my life and stalking out of the room, which is what many of my colleagues would do. We have obligations of civility. We have obligations of trying to maintain some sense of the equal right to exist of rival opinions. All of this, it seems to me, is part of the massive respect that is demanded on an equal basis in this huge experiment that we've made. In conversation before this evening's lecture, Alondra talked about the possibility of thinking about democratic hubris, that we might take these democratic ideas too far. But the premise of political equality is that we are prepared to take them pretty far. We're prepared to not only put up with rival views in this sense, but we are prepared to empower them and enfranchise them and build a political system based on them and rotate people in and out of office as a result of them and count them fairly and develop all the mechanisms that Professor Allen talked about, which require that sort of political fairness. And I want to open myself to the arguments that Professor Allen made about not just confining our sense of this respect and of the equal respect to the mechanisms of the electoral system, but to the broader structure of civil society and broader structures of informal civility as well as formal civility. So all of this is important, and it is anything but a tiny matter of etiquette. We take tremendous risks with each other's views. We take tremendous risks with each other's views, and there's an enormous amount of trust associated with political equality. And I think this clustering of demanding virtues associated with equal respect is extremely, extremely important. We hope that what this does is lead to a circulation of winners and losers, so that people are sometimes winning and sometimes losing, and that there are no persistent losers, at least at the level of their interests, maybe at the level of their opinions, but that people will, as Aristotle put it, and I'm conscious I'm speaking to somebody who knows a lot more about the classical world than I do, but that we will take turns ruling and being ruled. So all of this seems to be absolutely important for thinking about the respect that political equality connotes, why it has this strategic presence. The respect is a massively important phenomenon. One last point. The great French writer whom Danielle mentioned, Benjamin Constant, remember he was the one who talked about the liberties of the ancients, which is a positive liberty of participating, and the liberties of the moderns, which is our individual liberties and autonomies, and suggested that in the modern world we had to focus on the latter at the expense of the former. We couldn't be like the Athenians, finding fulfillment in public life. He also said this, and I've taken the liberty of bringing a quotation. He said, "We can no longer enjoy the liberty of the ancients, which consisted in an active and constant participation in collective power. The share which in antiquity everyone held in national sovereignty was by no means an abstract presumption, as it is in our day. The will of each individual had real influence. The exercise of this will was a vivid and repeated pleasure. Today, lost in the multitude, the individual can almost never perceive the influence he exercises. Never does his will impress itself on the whole. Nothing confirms in his eyes his own cooperation." Very familiar sentiment. My vote is just a drop in the bucket. And the toleration and respect for me as a political actor is just as one among 300 million or one among 100 million electors. So how can anything this trivial have this importance? That's the question. And here I think one of the points that I believe was made in this afternoon's seminars and was made briefly in this evening's discussion is that although political equality is important beyond belief to the dignity of individuals, although it's important for the way that we trust each other and respect each other and are patient with each other and take risks with each other, and although all of that happens in the first instance on an individual by individual basis, we tolerate each other as individuals, we enfranchise each other as individuals, we register for voting as individuals, we go to the polling machines as individuals, and our votes are counted one by one in a way that we hope is fair to us as individuals. Nevertheless, we vote and act in politics as members of groups as well. Voting is collective action because it takes more than one person to elect a president or to prevent a particular person from being elected president. We need to understand the group formation. I don't mean to be a collectivist about this, but voting is collective action. It's very, very complicated collective action. And there's a law professor whose name you may remember, Lani Guinier. Do you remember she was nominated for a position, I think Deputy Solicitor General, was it, in the Clinton administration? And then people found out that she had expressed sentiments like the ones I've just been expressing now, and she was thrown out of public life as a communist. But she maintained the point that it's very, very important to understand that political equality is something that we exercise together with others, and that our political voting rights we exercise together. If we had wanted to get Hillary Clinton elected president of the United States, we needed to act better in a collective way, right across the country, in Wisconsin as well as New York, to secure this outcome. And so that when we think about political equality, we need to understand that it has a group and collective dimension, a loose group and collective dimension, but a collective dimension nonetheless. And I think it's extremely important, therefore, to think, as Professor Allen has thought very deeply, about group formation, group looseness, about bridging as well as bonding connections, but to think about that specifically in the politics of our nation. But most of all, if I can just finish by saying this, most of all, I just wanted to stand here and applaud what we heard here today, because it is all too rare in political philosophy. I'm a political philosopher. It's all too rare in political philosophy that we actually hear such a vigorous defense of this egalitarian ideal related specifically to the political life of our country. So thank you for the opportunity to give these comments.
Okay, so, excuse me, the seat. Thank you so much. This was just terrific, and surely tonight we've cornered the market on the smartest people in Manhattan right now. I say that unequivocally. So we're going to. Thanks, Daniel. We're going to go pretty much straight to question and answer, but while people are getting up to ask questions, I mean, I guess I just wanted to say that it seemed to me, Danielle, on the one hand, you're suggesting that we shouldn't lose sight of political questions for economic ones. That's one sort of big gloss on your very more detailed paper. Jeremy, you're suggesting that we not lose sight of political action and political levers. And I think sort of, but still left unarticulated, was what to do around a loss of faith, a sense of a loss of respect, and thinking about where you ended, Jeremy, this wonderful idea about this return to collective action. But that requires, as you were suggesting a little bit, a sort of feeling of efficacy and trust around your individual drop in the bucket. And so I guess I wanted to, just to begin, to maybe hear both of you maybe say a few words about the project of restoration, of respect, of dignity, of faith that would be required to move us from economic questions or sort of domination in two ways, both of a kind of economic epistemology, but also a kind of social domination, and to move us to a kind of faith in political action again.
Well, there's a lot in the question, Alondra, so thank you very much. And let me just also thank you, Jeremy, for those incredible comments, super helpful, and I appreciate them. So I guess I would want to split your question into two parts. One about apathy and the contrast between apathy and engagement, and the other about dignity and polarization, I suppose, and how to think about the relationship between them. So on the first, I was telling sort of a story earlier today about my own personal experiments with apathy, which is to say, you can tell from everything I've said that I'm a pretty politically engaged and invested person. And as you might imagine, I'm sure it's true for others here, the last year has been very hard. And so I have my sort of head in the sand weeks where I just no news, like head in the sand. And my discovery from doing this is like the first time in my life I've ever done anything like that. And my discovery from this is that apathy is extremely pleasant. Truly. Like it's effectively speaking in terms of like psychology and emotions, it is great. And so then that makes me realize that to answer the question that you just asked, we actually have to understand, we spend all our time trying to understand the apathetic. What we actually need to do is understand the engaged. Why are these people engaged? And what can we learn from that then about re-engaging people, knowing that we have to overcome a pleasure, like apathy is a serious pleasure. And on polarization and dignity, I mean, I do there agree with what a lot of people are saying at this point about the need to restructure institutions to generate more circulation of people from different perspectives into shared conversations. And that's not to say that I think talk is everything, not at all, not by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that with regard to the issue of dignity in the first instance, it relates to that, what I sort of use the jargony phrase of epistemic egalitarianism for. That is, sorry, I'm going to a couple of jumps here. So one of my favorite thinkers is W.E.B. Du Bois, and he made the lovely argument that one of the goals of democracy is to give us all the chance to be co-creators in the kingdom of culture. And I think that is a good way of capturing part of what the need for dignity is about, is to see yourself in the culture somehow, not fully perfectly represented. We're not talking about sort of Rousseau and the sort of submergence of each of us in a kind of homogenous general will, not at all. But we need to see our voice somehow in the complicated weave that is the cultural fabric of the place. And I think that's what we have failed to achieve because of the sort of institutional segregation of our society. That segregation, of course, operates along any number of dimensions. So I don't mean that simply racially, I mean it socioeconomically, but also in ideological terms. And and it's obvious how we've gotten there, right? Like end of the draft, different approaches to the housing market. You can go through like a list of things that have generated this kind of segregation. The fact that kids who go away to college don't go home anymore. In the middle of the 20th century, they went home, which meant that communities throughout the Midwest were leavened by people who'd been at school in the East. And it meant that schools in the East or either coast, and the schools on the coasts were leavened with an alumni base that was still connected to the Midwest, right? And that's all like rolled up into just a purely kind of coastal set of communities. So there are any number of institutional things like that I think we actually need to reverse in order to have a functioning kind of cultural creation process where people can see their voices there. I'm bucking the hard question of trade-offs, right? Like the hard disagreements that we have with each other, where like it pisses me off when I see the voice of the baker who doesn't want to serve same-sex couples in the cultural landscape, right? And I would want to apply my difference without domination principle there and say, in that Supreme Court case, yeah, they do have to maintain equal protection of the law with regard to access to commercial things. It's like, I know my view about which way that case should come out. So that's that's where the hard trade-offs come in. But somehow we do need to have the voices operating there so that people can see themselves and then negotiate the settlements, as I call them, through our political institutions.
It's on, yes. I can't add a great deal to that. I think the idea of seeing our voice in the complicated weave of these structures is absolutely important. And I love the comments about the ways in which there can be leavening between the colleges and the interior of the country, as there was between public schools and ordinary families. The thing to add to that, I guess, is some recognition that this business of political equality is not easy. It's a demanding discipline. It's, when we think of one aspect of political equality, it's a tiny aspect, but it's a pain in the ass. Jury service. You get that threatening letter from the guy down in downtown saying, why haven't you responded to the previous threatening letter I sent you about jury service, and you have to go down and do it. Or standing in line at a polling place. waiting to vote. These are demanding things, and much more demanding is the trust and patience in two dimensions: trust and patience with one's political opponents, and trust and patience with one's fellow voters, that we can build a coalition that can do this. So we need to emphasize there's no easy way of doing this, and no magic way of restoring the hard work that needs to be done, and probably no magic way of just dissipating the resentment that comes in the feeling of many people that they have been edged out of the ordinary operating levers of the society and are expressing their anger in the political system to that regard. So all this is much more pessimistic, I'm afraid.
Thank you. So we have questions. Sir.
This question of respect of others' view, I disagree. In a way. Having spent my life more or less in politics, I always respect other people's views until I come to the conclusion that they're not even listening to what I'm saying, and they're in no way willing to in any way modify what they think, no matter how intelligent other people may speak and where the facts are. Facts become irrelevant. What do you?
Can I add a footnote to that question? Because I had a question for you there too. If that's all right. Which is, it's related. I mean, so I was a little unclear in your remarks there, where you shifted your vocabulary some, and I wasn't sure I completely tracked you. You talked about toleration of rival views, and I thought you did say respect of rival views too, and I wasn't sure if you meant that change from toleration to respect.
Yeah. No, on the second point, I did mean the two distinct attitudes. So you find a view that you massively disagree with. We'll come back to the person not listening just in a moment. You find a view that you massively disagree with, like the baker in the same-sex marriage cake case. And the first thing that you have to do is to say, well, I am not going to try to get this person killed or run out of the country in the way that dissident views are treated in a great many political systems. That's a toleration dimension, right? So there is such a thing as loyal opposition, even on a matter that we feel this strongly about. And the second is the respect aspect, which doesn't mean admire.
But is it respect to the view, or is it respect to the person? Because I respect the person I get.
Right.
So we have the view is a different question.
Well, we have to respect the view partly in order to respect the person. That is, we say, not only will this person not be run out of the country as un-American, but they will be empowered to bring a lawsuit. Yeah, and this particular lawsuit, not just any lawsuit. Yeah, they will be permitted, or to defend a lawsuit. They will be empowered to vote on some of these matters, not just any matter, but this matter. And in that sense, I think that there's indiscernible space between respecting the person and respecting the view, because what I'm saying now is that view has to be counted as well. It counts, not just it's tolerated, but it counts. Now, on the point about failure to listen and you respect somebody's views until it becomes clear that they're not listening to anything you say. And you're absolutely right, in a way Professor Allen captured this in her emphasis on reciprocity. Political equality is not just a partly collective notion, it's a binary virtue. It's a virtue that has to be reciprocated in order for it to work. I'm not sure that I have the same reaction as you do when I come across a brother-in-law at a Thanksgiving dinner who wants to defend the Trump administration or something like that and won't listen. I met your brother. Every Thanksgiving he's always there. Yeah? But you're absolutely right that the discipline that's demanded is a reciprocal discipline. This is like husband and wife stuff. It's a binary virtue that needs to be matched. And who knows what happens when a large number of people stop listening. One occasionally has to turn a little bit of introspection to oneself. Am I moderating my views in response to the ranting of my brother-in-law? Am I taking anything he says on board as well? So we ask that question as well, but it doesn't destroy the force of your point.
Thank you.
So there's a gentleman all the way in the back. Let's take two questions, Cole, and then the woman here in the teal.
I
blue.
would, to Professor Waldron, I understand conceptually, and it's certainly a lofty notion to respect each other's views on substance, but assume arguendo, without debating whether it's accurate or not, that one side procedurally is consistently trying to undermine the equality in terms of voting rights, in terms of gerrymandering, in terms of long lines in opposition territory at the voting booth. It seems to me that that's an impediment to then respecting the substance of these people on arguments on given positions when they're undermining the very equality about which you speak.
Let's hold that one.
And
The
then
right-
another question here.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Ashley. My question, I guess, is more oriented toward constitutional reform. I read your book, Our Democracy. I read it with my class. I went to Bard High School Early College, and it was our selected reading that we did for the latter half of the semester. So, thank you for being part of my semester that year. But I guess we're being faced with this question now of, and which is something that you bring up a lot in your book. How much face value can we take to the things that are written in the Constitution, the basic kind of rights that we have to hold? And I was studying last year in Berlin, and I did a segment on Deutsche Welle where we were talking, and we were actually like live with the election as it was happening, and I was there representing what it's like to be a minority living in the U.S. as is happening right now. And I guess the question that they threw at that I kind of was wondering is like what it really means to be an American in this day and age right now, what that means politically, and what that means as far as extending political equality to the citizens, because there isn't really a way to say, oh, you look like an American. And when you try to define it, it sounds horrible. So maybe for either or both of you, what you think as far as constitutional reform and in light of all the events that have happened in 2017. So it's a lot, but I also have class in like 20 minutes, so sorry, I'm a Hunter student. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to answer the first question about one side trying to undermine the very political equality that we're talking about here. And you're right, that has to be faced up to, but it has to be faced up to in this context. There is genuine good faith disagreement in the community about districting and redistricting. There is good faith disagreement in the community about voting rights and voter ID. There is good faith disagreement about many aspects of the electoral system. So the first thing we have to recognize is that views must be expressed on that. And it can't be the case that one side, us, comes into that debate knowing we're right and not wanting to listen to or respect the others in the senses, the two senses that I mentioned, that is tolerating them and empowering them if it comes to a vote. Then your point is absolutely right. In the context of that good faith disagreement, there'll be a lot of bad faith disagreement as well, that looks as though if we tolerate the good faith disagreement, we're going to have to tolerate these guys who are just trying to undermine, often racist, trying to undermine basic political equality. And if we empower those who disagree with us in good faith on these matters, we're going to end up empowering some of these bad faith participants in the debate as well. And I don't see any way out of that. These matters have to be decided. We have to have an electoral system, and that has to be conducted in the white heat of disagreement among the people about how it should be shaped and organized. So I'm as distressed as you are by people aiming consciously to disenfranchise many of their fellow citizens. But I can't see any alternative to the tolerate and empower discipline that I suggested.
So that, just a little footnote on that. I mean, it's interesting that you're making this distinction between good faith and bad faith participants. And so as I understand you, what you're saying is we have to accept a certain amount of bad faith along with the good faith. But that leaves, I mean, the question that you've just sort of put at the end that you say, in some sense, it's the end of the road for you is, you're not suggesting, you're not giving us any ways of thinking about, let's call it, quantitative degrees of bad faith. Right? At a certain point, if it's all bad faith, you're at the point where you're talking about the sort of the declarations like alter or abolish things when they're not working. You're at the abolish, not the alter part, right? And so that's the hard thing, I think, is that we don't, any of us, have a way of wrestling that good faith, bad faith distinction into something that we can make helpful use of. I mean, I think I agree with you in the sense I think we're in a place where the good faith balance is far greater than the bad faith balance. So in that regard, I'm willing to say for the moment of time that we're in, I think you're right. But I think analytically speaking, it's a hard problem. Right. So on the second question, constitutional reform issues. So I'm not going to directly address, say, the electoral college system, for instance. I would like to make a broader point. It does speak to Professor Waldron's point about the need to keep the political and political equality and to think about political institutions and how it is actually, what's the collection of mechanisms that we use to have our contests such that our voices are all empowered, heard, and so forth, and generates negotiated settlements that are tolerable, right? And you use the word bearable. You were saying our set's high, and your high sites were at the bearable. So, and that's sort of where mine are too, I have to admit. But I think it's important just to say that out loud to people. And at any rate, so I do think, so constitutional reform is really that question, like what's the collection of mechanisms and what is the framework for revisiting them? And I'm just gonna point out one thing about our situation currently that I think is relevant here, which is one of the things that democracies deal with is faction, right? And partly the mechanisms need to operate in order to break up factions so that it doesn't undo a kind of equilibrium of political equality. And the original constitutional design had the purpose of doing that. And Madison, in the Federalist Papers, gives us two premises for why he thinks the design will work to resolve or mitigate adequately the problem of faction. Not just majority factions. Anyway, we can get into the detail. But the two premises are geography, geographic dispersal. This is what makes it minority factions as well as majority factions, I would say, at any rate. Geographic dispersal, which would prevent people from combining across great distances, coupled with representation, which is a filtering effect, right? The first premise no longer operates, okay? And so I think there's lots of different places where some of the premises in our original institutional design no longer pertain. And the point of that is not to recommend one or another reform, but to say that the work of, as citizens, thinking through our political institutions is absolutely urgent. And it is work that we should be doing collectively. It's also work that I think we're not as well equipped to do as we should be, precisely because of the paradigm blindnesses that I was describing to start, that sort of put us always back thinking about economic questions, whereas we need to think about the design of political institutions and deepen our capacity to do that.
Yes. First of all, on behalf of Hunter College and the Graduate Center, I want to say that we're very honored to have Danielle and Jeremy here today in Roosevelt House. It's really great for us to have such eminent and distinguished political theorists here. The problem is that
I knew something else was coming.
This means that a Hunter political theorist is in the audience, and political theorists are paid to disagree with other political theorists. But I'm really not going to disagree with you a little bit with Danielle and a little bit with Jeremy, as much as to push you further. And first of all, as Danielle certainly knows, political equality in Athens was simply democracy. That's what democracy was. And we don't have, now of course, Athenian democracy was incomplete democracy, but what political equality means today is difficult because of what Jeremy noted, namely the difference between the ancients and the moderns, and that unfortunately didn't mention the fact that Constant thought that modernity was in trouble because it had forgotten a lot of the good lessons that the ancients had provided. And I'm just curious about if you could say a little bit more about the conceptual landscape you have laid out for us, and political actuality. Because I would say that most people in this room would agree with what you're saying, and most people outside this room would disagree. And yet you're talking about political equality and democracy. And in particular, if you could talk about that resistance and what might inform it and what might change it. And one of the things that I guess I would like you to try to do a little bit more is to talk about the relationship between political equality and these other forms, because, as Jeremy had mentioned this in his remarks, because they aren't really clearly separated. And if you talk about, for example, production, when you're talking about political economy, and you were to ask, Karl Marx, he would say, well, then you have to think about distribution, exchange, and consumption, because they're all linked. So I'm asking you to talk, first of all, I guess, about the way in which people outside could be persuaded to make political equality a value when it's just not immediately clear what that is in relationship to these other kinds of equality. And secondly, exactly how you understand the relationship between political equality and political economy as a practical phenomenon that would be of interest to voters.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and for your riveting conversation. I myself am very skeptical of the strength and capacity of our political institutions in the United States, especially to deal with the most pressing problems facing us, whether it's domestic issues like immigration or foreign policy issues like the deterioration of multilateral institutions. It seems like we're really struggling with confronting the most pressing issues facing us. And I was just curious if either you, Professor Allen, or Professor Waldron, see areas for opportunity or openness in our political systems in areas that are vulnerable to be changed for the better to increase political equality. Thank you.
That's great. Great set of questions. And they go together nicely, actually. It's nice. So thank you for making that a little easier. So let me just repeat questions. I mean, so basically, how can we get the ideal of political equality taken up outside of this kind of space? How does political equality relate to political economy in ways that matter to voters? So that then all connects to your question about where are there places that we could reform our political institutions, where it's feasible to do reform, and where the reforms would, in fact, help support political equality. So there was a nice progression in those questions. And it's funny because we spent some time before we started this program together upstairs talking actually a little bit about this. What's the role of a political philosopher in political questions? And it's hard because political philosophers, I mean, I like to say, leap tall buildings at a single bound, right? Let's say we're unencumbered. We can, exactly. We sort of, move rapidly through time and space as we lay out these abstract conceptions. And so the question of how those come back to ground is a real and hard one. So I don't have an easy answer to your question, John, about how we get the value of political equality taken up, other than in the same standard ways, which is to say, you do your best to clarify your ideas, you do your best to learn how to present them as lucidly as possible, and you have to do exactly what you just put on the table for us, actually provide answers to those concrete questions. We were talking about this as finding the anchor points for the abstract ideas, right? The actual thing that you can do, which is an instantiation of the idea, which begins to drive change, but also simultaneously teaches people a different way of thinking about the questions. And I mean, I have a list of things that I think are relevant here, and my hard problem actually is prioritizing among them and figuring out which is the most effective thing to focus on. So for example, I invoked the Fair Representation Act as a point. I actually think that with regard to political economy, issues of the differential cost of housing between urban areas and rural areas, and the consequent remarkable reduction in mobility for Americans is huge, and has a huge impact on people's sense of being excluded from various kinds of contexts of decision making as well. So they're in kind of link between the economic and the political issue there. Like I literally, like I could give you a list like this of specific policy areas that I think would have different answers if you started from this position. And my hard problem is figuring out how on earth to prioritize in terms of thinking about these things.
So thank you for your question. Everyone has their list of institutions that might be vulnerable to improvement. It was a wonderful phrase that you used. And I just have two suggestions, but they're not ranked in any order of priorities, and they're partly...
I was able to say two. See, this is the thing. I'm hoping to get there. That's where I'm trying to get.
One is a general enhancement in the level of civility within our political institutions, and that primarily means Congress. And there are a number of voices, as you know, that call for this with some regularity. Senator McCain, Senator Rubio even. Is that right, from Florida? Yes, from Arizona. McCain. Yes, absolutely. So developing a more normative culture of civility, which ranges across the whole thing from politeness to willingness to cooperate to refusing to denounce as disloyal, even in the context of severe disagreement. But here's a more controversial one, which I think is connected with it. Yesterday, in Australia, there was a referendum on same-sex marriage. And by a 2-to-1 majority, the Australian people voted in favor of same-sex marriage, which will now come forward to the legislature in the form of a bill for enactment. New Zealanders smile knowingly at this because we passed our same-sex marriage, or the reform of marriage bill, some 4 or 5 years ago in a glorious moment in the Parliament. And that's the way in which same-sex marriage has been developed in country after country, Ireland, all sorts of other countries, through voting among the people and their representatives. And I believe that much as we, and I'm a lawyer, so this is against interest, I believe that it's much better and leads to more civil outcomes to have this matter determined by voters and have this matter determined by representative institutions than to have it determined by courts. I know it's not always possible to get the right result from the voters, although people have to be patient and they have to understand the other point of view. But in an election or in a referendum, what you say at the end to those who have been defeated, like the opponents of same-sex marriage, the 38% in Australia yesterday, is you just say, you lost. You don't say your view has been shown to be beyond the pale of a decent politics, which is effectively what a Supreme Court decision is. And so I think that we need to get more used to solving and resolving our bitterest disputes through political representative procedures than all the time through court decisions and the work of lawyers.
I just want to add one other little footnote, though, just to say that in respect to things that are vulnerable to reform, we can respect that phrase. So this country has this remarkable federal structure, right, with all these different levels of political operation. And the fact of the matter is a heck of a lot of power sits on the table uncontested, particularly at the state and municipal level, so that the number of people who run unopposed just keeps going up. So that's where I start in thinking about where is there reform to be had. The first start is just plain, let's get people back contesting lots of those uncontested seats.
So thank you, Danielle, for your magnificent lecture. Jeremy, for your wonderful and enriching commentary. And thank you both for what has been a kind of intellectual refuge from what Jeremy called the white heat of our disagreement. So it was nice to take pause this evening together and really think at a higher level of both abstraction and idealism about where we might be headed. Thanks again to the Roosevelt House for providing such a great site for this rich and important conversation. I hope that you'll all please join us upstairs for food and drink in the Four Freedoms room and to have your book signed by Professor Allen and Waldron. Thank you all very much for coming.